The massive crystalline chambers of the Galactic Council hummed with the voices of 1,000 species, their translators working overtime to convert alien thoughts into comprehensible discourse. Ambassador Zethkara of the Vorthak Empire adjusted his ceremonial robes as he approached the central podium, his 6 eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Today would mark the final nail in humanity's coffin. Honored members of the Council, Zethkara's voice boomed through the chamber, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. We gather today to address the problem of the human species and their pathetic attempt at galactic citizenship. A ripple of agreement swept through the assembly. The Kree delegation chittered their approval, while the silicon-based crystallines pulsed with harmonious light. Even the usually neutral ethereals seemed to nod their gaseous forms in consensus. On Earth, Marcus Thompson sat in his small apartment in Detroit, watching the proceedings on his ancient holographic display. The 42-year-old former Marine had seen enough combat zones to recognize a setup when he saw one. His weathered hands gripped his coffee mug tighter as he listened to the systematic destruction of his species' reputation. The humans, Zethkara continued, have proven themselves incapable of basic interstellar cooperation. Their primitive military thinking, their stubborn refusal to accept proper galactic hierarchy, and their constant questions about our established protocols make them unsuitable for continued membership. The accusations weren't entirely false, Marcus had to admit. Humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council 3 years ago had been rocky. When the Council's representatives arrived with their gleaming ships and superior technology, they expected immediate submission to their carefully structured civilization. What they got instead was a species that asked uncomfortable questions. Why did the Council's protection services cost exactly 70% of a planet's resources? Why were humans expected to abandon their military traditions when every other species maintained some form of defense force? Why did the Council's trade agreements always seem to favor the founding members? These questions had not been well received. Furthermore, Zethkara's voice dripped with disdain. Their so-called military prowess is laughably primitive. They still rely on chemical propulsion, kinetic weapons, and crude tactical thinking. Any species that considers such outdated methods effective has no place among civilized galactic society. Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in the Martian colonies before first contact. He'd seen what human primitive tactics could accomplish when properly applied. The Council members were making a fatal error in judgment, but they were too arrogant to see it. The human delegation sat in uncomfortable silence in their assigned seats at the back of the chamber. Ambassador Sarah Chun, Earth's primary representative, looked defeated. She'd spent 3 years trying to navigate the Council's labyrinthine politics, only to watch her efforts crumble under the weight of species prejudice. The motion before us is simple, Zethkara announced. Immediate revocation of humanity's provisional membership, followed by complete trade embargo and exclusion from galactic protection services. Let them survive on their own if they're so confident in their primitive ways. The vote was a foregone conclusion. Species after species registered their approval, each vote another step toward humanity's isolation. Marcus watched the tally climb with growing anger. The Council wasn't just rejecting humanity. They were condemning an entire species to struggle alone in a hostile galaxy. But as the votes continued, something interesting happened. Marcus began to notice the pattern behind the rhetoric. The Vorthak Empire had been pushing this agenda for months, ever since humanity had refused their generous offer to establish military bases throughout human space. The Kree had joined the anti-human coalition after Earth scientists had questioned their monopoly on quantum computing technology. The crystallines were still angry about humanity's refusal to accept their spiritual guidance and abandon what they called primitive religious beliefs. This wasn't about humanity's supposed inadequacies. This was about control. The vote concluded with overwhelming support for the motion. Ambassador Chen closed her eyes as the final tally was announced. Humanity was officially expelled from galactic civilization, effective immediately. The council chamber erupted in satisfied murmurs and self-congratulatory gestures. Marcus turned off his display and sat in the growing darkness of his apartment. Outside, Detroit's lights twinkled in the early evening, oblivious to the cosmic rejection that had just occurred. His neighbors were going about their daily lives, unaware that their species had just been declared unwelcome in the larger universe. But Marcus wasn't thinking about defeat. His military mind was already working through the implications, the opportunities, and the potential responses. The council had just made their greatest mistake, though they didn't know it yet. He picked up his secure communicator and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The voice that answered was gruff and familiar. "Tom Rodriguez here." "Tom, it's Marcus. I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Shoot. How many of the boys from our old unit are still around? And, more importantly, how many of them are as pissed off as I am right now?" There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. "Marcus, you just watched the same broadcast I did, didn't you? Every damned second of it. Then, you already know the answer. When do we start?" Marcus smiled for the first time in hours. The Galactic Council thought they knew humans. They'd studied Earth's governments, analyzed their military structures, and concluded that humanity's strength lay in their formal institutions. They'd made the classic mistake of confusing the government with the people. They were about to learn the difference. "I'll be in touch," Marcus said. "And Tom, start reaching out to the others. It's time these aliens learned what happens when you write off the wrong species." As Marcus ended the call, his mind was already racing through possibilities. The council controlled the major trade routes, the established colonies, and the recognized territories. But space was vast, and there were plenty of places where their authority was more theoretical than practical. Humanity had just been given an ultimatum: submit or survive alone. The council expected submission through desperation. What they would get instead was something they'd never encountered before, a species that thrived on being underestimated. The next morning, Marcus began making calls, not to politicians or diplomats, but to soldiers, engineers, and explorers. People who understood that sometimes the best response to impossible odds was to change the rules of the game entirely. Within a week, he'd assembled a network of contacts that spanned from the outer colonies to Earth's major cities. Former military personnel, frustrated scientists, independent traders, and civilian volunteers who'd grown tired of watching their species grovel before alien authority. The plan that began to emerge wasn't about rejoining the council or seeking their approval. It was about building something better, something that would make the council's rejection look like the favor it actually was. The Galactic Council had just declared war on humanity, though they disguised it as diplomacy. They expected a quick surrender followed by decades of profitable exploitation. Instead, they'd awakened something that had been sleeping since humanity's last great crisis. The same spirit that had carried the species from caves to stars, that had turned every setback into a setup for greater achievements. Marcus stood at his window, looking up at the stars that the council now claimed were forbidden to his kind. In the reflection of the glass, he could see the ghost of the Marine he used to be, and for the first time in years, that man was smiling. The council thought they'd written off humanity. What they'd actually done was write their own obituary. They just didn't know it yet. 6 months after humanity's expulsion from the Galactic Council, Marcus Thompson stood in an abandoned mining facility on Ceres, watching the most unlikely military briefing in human history. The massive chamber had been converted into a command center, its walls lined with jury-rigged communication equipment and tactical displays that would have made any Pentagon official weep with envy. Around the room, representatives from dozens of human settlements reported in. There was Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Tau Ceti colonies, her weathered face bearing the scars of countless asteroid mining operations. Commander David Park transmitted from the generation ship New Horizon, which had been carrying 30,000 colonists toward unexplored space when the Council's embargo cut them off from their planned destination. Dr. Elena Vasquez joined from the research station orbiting Jupiter, Her team of xenobiologists now focused on understanding their former allies' weaknesses rather than their cultures. Status report. Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd never quite lost despite leaving the Marines years ago. The outer colonies are holding steady, Captain Walsh reported. The Council's embargo hurt, but we've been adapting. Amazing what people can accomplish when their survival depends on it. The generation ships are regrouping, Commander Park added. We've established contact with 7 other vessels. They're forming a convoy system for mutual protection and resource sharing. And the research stations have made some interesting discoveries, Dr. Vasquez said, her eyes gleaming with the excitement of a scientist who'd stumbled onto something significant. Turns out the Council's technology isn't quite as advanced as they led us to believe. Marcus nodded. The reports have been consistently encouraging over the past few months. Rather than collapsing under the pressure of galactic isolation, humanity had begun to adapt and improvise in ways that even surprised him. The Council's embargo had cut off access to their trade networks and technology, but it had also forced humans to develop their own solutions. What's the situation with the alien civilizations? Marcus asked. Tom Rodriguez, now serving as Marcus's second-in-command, pulled up a holographic display showing the known galaxy. Red dots marked Council-controlled territories, while yellow indicators showed the locations of independent civilizations, species that either weren't part of the Council or had been excluded from membership. That's where things get interesting, Tom said. Turns out humanity isn't the only species the Council has written off. There are at least 47 independent civilizations scattered across this sector alone, and most of them have their own grievances with our former friends. The Nexary Republic, for instance, Dr. Vasquez interjected. They were denied Council membership because their democratic government was deemed inefficient. The Corvin clans were rejected for being too warlike, despite the fact that half the Council species maintain standing armies. And the Zephyrian Collective was excluded because their hive mind structure made the Council nervous. Marcus studied the display with growing interest. The Council had positioned itself as the sole representative of galactic civilization, but the reality was far different. They were simply one faction among many, albeit the most powerful and well-organized. What about their military capabilities? Marcus asked. That's where our situation gets complicated, Captain Walsh admitted. Individually, none of these independent civilizations can match the Council's military power. Their technology is generally superior to ours, and they have the advantage of numbers. But they also have weaknesses. She manipulated the display to show detailed tactical analyses. The Council's military doctrine is built around overwhelming technological superiority and quick, decisive battles. They're used to facing opponents who either submit immediately or get crushed by superior firepower. They've never had to deal with asymmetric warfare or prolonged resistance. Tom grinned. In other words, they've never fought humans. Exactly. Their commanders are politicians and bureaucrats who've won their positions through council politics rather than military merit. They think in terms of formal declarations of war, set peace battles, and negotiated surrenders. Dr. Vasquez pulled up another display showing council ship movements over the past 6 months. They've been sending patrol fleets to human territory, but they're following predictable patterns. They show up, scan for activity, deliver warnings about violating their territory restrictions, and then leave. They're treating this like a police action rather than a military campaign. Marcus felt a familiar surge of tactical excitement. The enemy was revealing their assumptions, their blind spots, and their operational patterns. Any good strategist could work with that information. What about resources? He asked. That's actually our biggest advantage, Commander Park reported. The Council controls the established trade routes and the major settled systems, but they've largely ignored the frontier regions. There are entire star systems out there with valuable resources that they've never bothered to claim. Because they prefer to exploit existing civilizations rather than develop new territories, Captain Walsh added. Why spend resources on exploration and development when you can simply demand tribute from species that have already done the work? Meanwhile, Dr. Vasquez continued, our research teams have been analyzing the technology samples we gathered during our brief council membership. Their equipment is certainly advanced, but it's also standardized and predictable. They've optimized their technology for efficiency and mass production, not for adaptation or innovation. Marcus began to see the shape of an opportunity. The council had grown comfortable with their position of dominance. They'd become bureaucratic, predictable, and complacent. They expected challenges to come through formal diplomatic channels or conventional military confrontation. All right, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone that had once commanded Marines in combat zones. Let's talk about what we're really here to discuss. The Council thinks they've neutralized humanity by cutting us off from their civilization. They're wrong. What they've actually done is give us the freedom to build something better. The room fell silent as everyone focused on his words. We're not trying to get back into the Council, Marcus continued. We're not going to beg for their approval or acceptance. Instead, we're going to build our own network, an alliance of independent civilizations that offers everything the Council does, but without the exploitation and arrogance. A counter-council, Tom mused. I like it. Think about it, Marcus said, warming to his theme. The Council maintains control by convincing civilizations that they're the only source of advanced technology, interstellar trade, and galactic protection. But what if that wasn't true? What if there was an alternative? Dr. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. We reach out to the other independent civilizations. Offer them something the Council can't. True partnership instead of subjugation. The Nexari have excellent manufacturing capabilities, Captain Walsh added. The Corvin clans are brilliant tacticians. The Zephyrian Collective has computational power that rivals anything the Council possesses. And humans, Commander Park said with a growing smile, have something none of them have ever seen before. The ability to adapt, improvise, and overcome impossible odds through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. Marcus walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars. In the distance, he could see the lights of human settlements scattered across the asteroid belt, each one a testament to his species' refusal to accept defeat. The Council made a fundamental mistake, he said. They assumed that exclusion meant isolation, that rejection meant defeat. They didn't understand that sometimes being kicked out of the club is exactly the motivation you need to build a better organization. Over the next several hours, they outlined the basics of what would become known as the Independent Alliance. It wouldn't be a formal government or a hierarchical organization like the Council. Instead, it would be a voluntary network of civilizations committed to mutual defense, technological sharing, and economic cooperation. The first step was establishing contact with potential partners. Human ships, now free from Council navigation restrictions, would begin exploring the frontier regions and making contact with independent civilizations. They would offer technology sharing, mutual defense pacts, and trade agreements that didn't involve tribute payments or resource extraction. The second step was developing the infrastructure for independent trade networks. Human engineering expertise, combined with Nexari manufacturing and Zephyrian computational power, could create supply lines that bypassed Council-controlled space entirely. The third step was the most ambitious, demonstrating that the Independent Alliance could provide security that matched or exceeded what the Council offered. This would require military capabilities that could deter Council aggression while remaining defensive in nature. It won't be easy, Marcus warned. The Council won't tolerate competition. Eventually, they'll try to crush us before we can become a real threat to their monopoly. Let them come, Tom said. We'll give them a demonstration of human military doctrine they won't forget. The key is timing, Dr. Vasquez added. We need to build the alliance quietly while the Council still thinks we're irrelevant. By the time they realize what we're doing, it'll be too late to stop us through simple intimidation. As the briefing concluded, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his Marine days, the satisfaction of a plan that just might work. The Council had meant to destroy humanity's galactic ambitions. Instead, they'd inadvertently given humanity the greatest gift possible: freedom from their restrictions. The Independent Alliance would rise from humanity's rejection, stronger and more principled than the organization that had cast them out. The Council had written off humans as primitive and unsuitable for galactic civilization. They were about to discover that being underestimated by humanity was the last mistake many enemies ever made. The Defiant Spirit dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Nexary system, its hull scarred from months of travel through uncharted space. Captain Jennifer Walsh stood on the bridge, studying the sensor readings with the kind of focused intensity that had kept her alive through 3 decades of asteroid mining in hostile territory. This moment would determine whether Marcus Thompson's ambitious plan had any chance of success. "Captain," her communications officer reported, "we're being scanned by at least 12 different sensor arrays. Military grade, but they're not locking onto us as targets." "Defensive positioning," Jennifer observed. "They're cautious, but not immediately hostile." Good sign. The Nexary Republic had been on humanity's contact list for obvious reasons. Like Earth's governments, they've been deemed inefficient by the Galactic Council due to their democratic decision-making processes. Unlike the Council's preferred autocratic client states, the Nexary actually consulted their population before making major decisions. "Incoming transmission," the communications officer announced. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a being that looked like a cross between a large cat and a classical centaur. Nexary physiology was imposing without being threatening. Their feline features suggested both intelligence and predatory capability, while their 4-legged body structure conveyed stability and strength. "Unknown vessel." The Nexary spoke in accented but clear Standard Galactic. "You are approaching Republic space without proper clearance. State your identity and intentions." Jennifer stepped forward, clasping her hands behind her back in a gesture of formal respect. "I am Captain Jennifer Walsh of the human vessel Defiant Spirit. We request permission to enter your system for the purpose of diplomatic contact." The Nexary's ears twitched, an expression Jennifer hoped indicated surprise rather than hostility. "Humans, we were informed that your species had been removed from galactic society." "That's correct," Jennifer replied. "We're no longer members of the Galactic Council. That's actually why we're here." There was a long pause as the Nexary presumably consulted with his superiors. When he returned to the screen, his expression had shifted from bureaucratic caution to genuine curiosity. "You are cleared to approach Nexary Prime, Captain Walsh. A diplomatic escort will meet you at the outer system beacon. Fair warning, our government will want to understand your intentions very clearly before allowing you to proceed." 6 hours later, Jennifer found herself in the most unusual diplomatic meeting of her career. The Nexary Council chamber was a fascinating blend of technology and natural design, with crystalline displays growing directly from living wooden surfaces. The air smelled of ozone and forest flowers, while the gentle hum of organic machinery created an oddly soothing background. President Veltar of the Nexary Republic was an impressive figure, her silver-striped fur and ancient scars telling the story of a leader who'd earned her position through merit rather than appointment. Around the circular chamber, 12 other Nexary represented their planet's major population centers and industrial regions. "Captain Walsh," President Veltar began, "your arrival has created considerable discussion among our people. We were told that humanity had been rejected by the Galactic Council for incompatible cultural values. Among other things," Jennifer admitted, "the Council expected us to abandon our military traditions, accept their resource extraction quotas, and stop asking inconvenient questions about their governance structure. We declined." A ripple of what Jennifer hoped was amusement passed through the Nexary representatives. "Yes," President Veltar said dryly, "we're familiar with their attitude towards civilizations that value independence." Jennifer activated her portable holographic display, showing the same galactic map that Marcus had presented during their planning sessions. "The Council wants everyone to believe They represent galactic civilization. The reality is different. There are dozens of independent civilizations scattered across this region, each with their own strengths and capabilities. We've been aware of this for some time, another Nexri representative interjected. But the Council's technological and military advantages have made cooperation between independent civilizations challenging. That's where humanity comes in, Jennifer said. We're proposing something different, not a challenge to the Council's authority, but an alternative to their system entirely. She spent the next hour outlining Marcus's vision for the Independent Alliance. The Nexri listened with growing interest as she described the potential for technology sharing, mutual defense agreements, and trade networks that didn't involve tribute payments to distant overlords. Your proposal is intriguing, President Veltar said when Jennifer finished. But there are practical concerns. The Council has made it clear that they consider cooperation with expelled species to be a violation of galactic law. Whose law? Jennifer asked. The Council's charter gives them authority over member species and their territory. But independent civilizations have never agreed to Council jurisdiction. They can't legislate sovereignty they don't possess. The Nexri representatives exchanged glances, their equivalent of raised eyebrows, Jennifer realized. You've clearly given this considerable thought, President Veltar observed. We've had help, Jennifer admitted. It turns out that when you exclude enough civilizations from your club, some of them start talking to each other. Over the next 3 days, Jennifer participated in the most exhaustive diplomatic process she'd ever experienced. The Nexri didn't just consider her proposal. They subjected it to analysis by their best economists, military strategists, and social scientists. Unlike the Council's top-down decision-making, the Nexri actually cared about the long-term consequences of their choices. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Commander Lokhtar, the Nexri's senior military advisor. Jennifer had been explaining human military doctrine when he interrupted with a question that changed everything. You said that humans specialize in asymmetric warfare. Can you give me a specific example? Jennifer thought for a moment, then activated her display to show a historical timeline. 300 years ago, human military forces faced an enemy with superior technology, overwhelming numerical advantages, and control of strategic resources. The conventional wisdom was that resistance would be futile. What happened? The humans changed the rules of engagement. Instead of fighting the kind of war their enemies expected, they adapted their tactics to exploit their opponent's assumptions and weaknesses. It took longer, and it cost more, but eventually the technologically superior force was defeated by an opponent who refused to fight on their terms. Commander Lokhtar's tail twitched with interest. And you believe this approach would work against the Council? I believe the Council has the same weakness as every powerful organization that's grown comfortable with its dominance. They've optimized for fighting enemies who challenge them directly. They're not prepared for opponents who change the nature of the conflict itself. Show me. For the next several hours, Jennifer outlined the strategic thinking behind Marcus's plan. The Independent Alliance wouldn't try to match the Council's technological superiority or challenge them in formal fleet engagements. Instead, they would build an alternative system that made the Council's advantages irrelevant. The Council maintains control through economic dependency, Jennifer explained. Civilizations need their trade networks, their technology, and their protection services. But what if those needs could be met without accepting Council authority? You're talking about replacing their entire infrastructure, Commander Lokhtar observed. Not replacing, circumventing. The galaxy is vast, and the Council only controls a fraction of its resources. There are entire regions they've never bothered to explore, systems they've dismissed as unimportant, and civilizations they've ignored because exploiting them wouldn't be profitable enough. Commander Lokhtar studied the strategic projections with growing excitement. A distributed network rather than a centralized hierarchy. Redundant supply chains that can't be disrupted by controlling key systems. Defense strategies that make occupation more costly than negotiation. Exactly. The Council's power depends on everyone believing they're the only option. Once it's no longer true, their entire system becomes vulnerable. The final vote came after a full planetary referendum, a process that would have driven Council bureaucrats to distraction, but which the Nexury considered essential for any major policy decision. The results were overwhelmingly in favor of joining the Independent Alliance. Captain Walsh, President Veltar said during the formal signing ceremony, "The Nexury Republic is honored to be the first species to join humanity's vision for galactic cooperation." "With respect, Madam President," Jennifer replied, "this isn't humanity's vision. This is our vision. The Alliance succeeds because it belongs to everyone who builds it." As the Defiant Spirit prepared to leave Nexury space, Jennifer reviewed the agreements they'd negotiated. The Nexury would provide manufacturing expertise and industrial capacity in exchange for human engineering innovations and military consultation. More importantly, they would serve as a test case for whether the Alliance concept could work in practice. The next stop was the Corvin clans, followed by the Zephyrian Collective. Each contact would build on the success of the previous one, creating a network of civilizations that could offer genuine alternatives to Council membership. But as Jennifer watched Nexury Prime disappear behind them, she was already thinking about the larger implications of their success. The Nexury had joined the Alliance because it offered them something the Council couldn't: respect for their values and autonomy over their decisions. The Council had rejected humanity as unsuitable for galactic civilization. What they'd failed to recognize was that perhaps their version of civilization was unsuitable for the galaxy. The Independent Alliance would offer a different model, one based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced hierarchy. Marcus had been right about the fundamental flaw in the Council's thinking. They'd assumed that exclusion meant defeat, that rejection meant isolation. Instead, they'd given humanity the opportunity to build something better. The ex-Marines' plan was working. Now came the hard part, proving that it could survive contact with the enemy. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the early hours of Vorthak Prime's morning cycle, with representatives scrambling to attend via emergency transmission protocols. Ambassador Zethkura stood before the assembly, his usually perfect composure showing cracks of genuine concern for the first time in his political career. "Honored members," he began, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled anger, "we have a situation that threatens the very foundations of galactic order." The Central Chamber's displays activated, showing intelligence reports that had been flooding in over the past 3 months. Trade agreements between previously isolated civilizations. Technology transfers that bypassed Council oversight. Military cooperation pacts between species that had never even communicated before humanity's expulsion. "The humans," Zethkara continued, "have not simply accepted their rejection from civilized society. They have begun actively undermining our authority by organizing resistance among the galaxy's unaligned civilizations." A murmur of concern rippled through the assembly. Supreme Chancellor Mordak of the Kree delegation leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the light from the tactical displays. "Surely this is merely a temporary inconvenience. A few primitive species banding together cannot challenge our established order." "That was our initial assessment," Zethkara admitted. "We were wrong." The displays shifted to show economic projections that sent a chill through the chamber. Trade volume through Council-controlled routes had dropped by 12% in the past quarter. Resource extraction quotas from client civilizations were falling short of projections. Most alarming of all, 3 Council member species had formally requested reviews of their tribute obligations. "The humans have created what they call an independent alliance," Zethkara explained. "It offers everything we provide: trade networks, technology sharing, mutual defense, but without the tribute requirements or governance oversight that ensure proper galactic stability." High synthesizer Kethmos of the Crystalline Confederation pulsed with agitated light patterns. "This is unacceptable. These primitive species must be reminded of their place in the galactic hierarchy. Our intelligence indicates that the situation is worse than these reports suggest." Zethkara, continued grimly. The humans have not simply formed an alliance with other rejects. They've systematically identified and exploited weaknesses in our entire system. The displays showed detailed analysis of Alliance activities. Unlike the Council's centralized structure, the Alliance operated as a distributed network with no single point of failure. Their trade routes avoided Council space entirely, utilizing previously unexplored systems and establishing new colonial outposts in regions the Council had deemed unworthy of development. Most concerning, Zethkara added, is their military doctrine. Our strategic analysis indicates that they've abandoned conventional fleet engagement tactics in favor of something they call asymmetric resistance strategy. Admiral Thexvar of the Council Defense Forces activated his own tactical displays. The humans have been studying our military protocols for 3 years. They understand our standard operational procedures, our logistics requirements, and our decision-making hierarchies. Their alliance partners have been trained in countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize our technological advantages. The implications sent another wave of concern through the assembly. The Council's military dominance had always been based on overwhelming technological superiority and quick, decisive victories. Their enemies either surrendered immediately when faced with superior firepower, or were crushed so thoroughly that resistance became impossible. What exactly are they doing differently? Chancellor Murdoch demanded. Admiral Thexvar manipulated the displays to show recent intelligence reports from the frontier regions. They've established supply caches throughout unexplored space, created redundant communication networks that can't be disrupted by controlling single systems, and developed mobile shipyard facilities that can relocate faster than our fleets can track them. Furthermore, Zethkara added, they're not targeting our military assets directly. Instead, they're systematically undermining our economic and political foundations. Every species that joins their alliance reduces our resource base and influence. Every successful alliance operation demonstrates that Council membership isn't necessary for galactic prosperity. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Council's power had always been based on the assumption that they were indispensable. Independent civilizations accepted Council authority because they believed it was the only path to advanced technology, interstellar commerce, and protection from external threats. If the Alliance could provide those same benefits without the costs, the entire foundation of Council authority would crumble. What do you propose? Supreme Chancellor Murdoch asked. Direct military intervention, Admiral Thexvar declared. We assemble a fleet large enough to crush the Alliance before it can expand further. One decisive demonstration of our power will remind the galaxy why Council authority exists. That approach carries significant risks, High Synthesizer Kethmos observed. Military action against civilian populations would damage our reputation for legitimate governance. The Alliance members aren't civilians, Admiral Thexvar countered. They're active participants in an illegal rebellion against established galactic authority. We have every right to defend our legitimate interests. Zethkara activated another set of displays showing strategic projections. Admiral Thexvar's approach has merit, but our intelligence indicates that the humans have prepared for exactly this response. They've positioned their most valuable assets in systems that would be difficult to attack without causing massive civilian casualties among Alliance populations. They're using their own people as shields? Chancellor Murdoch asked with disgust. No, Zethkara admitted reluctantly. They've integrated their military and civilian infrastructure in ways that make surgical strikes impossible. Any attack on Alliance military assets would necessarily affect civilian populations, which would create sympathy for their cause among neutral civilizations. The human strategy was becoming clear. They weren't trying to defeat the Council in direct military confrontation. Instead, they were maneuvering the Council into a position where any use of force would damage the Council's reputation for legitimate authority. There must be a solution, High Synthesizer Kethmos insisted. We cannot allow this challenge to our authority to succeed. There is Admiral Thexvar said grimly. We escalate beyond surgical strikes. We make it clear that rebellion against the Council will result in the complete destruction of the rebellious civilizations. Once we demonstrate our willingness to use overwhelming force, other species will reconsider the wisdom of joining the alliance. A shocked silence followed this proposal. The Council had always maintained its authority through the threat of force rather than its actual use. The suggestion of genocide as a political tool crossed lines that even some Council hardliners found uncomfortable. That would make us no better than the barbarian empires we replaced, one of the ethereal representatives objected. Better than allowing the galaxy to descend into chaos, Admiral Thexvar replied. Sometimes maintaining civilization requires difficult choices. The debate that followed revealed deep fractures in Council unity. The hardliners, led by Zethkura and Admiral Thexvar, argued for immediate military action regardless of casualties. The moderates worried about the precedent of using genocidal force against civilian populations. The pragmatists questioned whether any military solution could succeed against an enemy that had specifically prepared for Council retaliation. Finally, Supreme Chancellor Mordak called for order. We will proceed with a graduated response. Economic sanctions against any civilization that provides support to the Alliance. Military pressure against Alliance supply lines and infrastructure. And if necessary, targeted strikes against Alliance military assets. And if that fails, Zethkura asked, then we consider more extreme measures, Chancellor Mordak replied. But we maintain the moral authority that justifies our leadership of galactic civilization. As the session concluded, none of the Council members noticed the small human observation vessel that had been monitoring their communications from beyond the system's detection grid. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her intelligence team had spent months developing the technology to intercept Council transmissions, and their work was finally paying dividends. Did you get all of that? Dr. Vasquez asked her communications specialist. Every word, he confirmed, including the parts where they debated committing genocide to maintain political control. Dr. Vasquez smiled grimly. Marcus is going to find this very interesting. The Council just revealed their true nature to the entire galaxy. The intelligence coup was even more valuable than she'd hoped. Not only had they learned the Council's strategic plans, but they'd recorded Council leaders explicitly discussing the use of overwhelming force against civilian populations. The recordings would be invaluable for recruiting neutral civilizations who might question the Council's claims to moral authority. But, more importantly, the intercepted communications revealed something that Marcus had suspected but couldn't prove until now. The Council was afraid. For the first time in their history, they faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated or bribed into submission. The Independent Alliance had achieved something that no previous challenger had managed. They'd created genuine uncertainty about the Council's inevitable victory. As Dr. Vasquez's ship slipped away into hyperspace, carrying its precious intelligence cargo back to Alliance Command, the Council's fleet began mobilizing for what they assumed would be a quick police action against primitive rebels. They were about to discover that the ex-Marine who'd planned this campaign had spent considerable time studying what happened to powerful organizations that underestimated their opponents. The Council was walking into exactly the kind of trap that Marcus Thompson had been building since the day humanity was expelled from galactic civilization. #The Reckoning Marcus Thompson stood in the command center of the Alliance fleet, watching the holographic display that showed the approaching Council armada. 200 ships in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the advanced technology that had intimidated galactic civilizations for centuries. It was the largest military force the Council had ever assembled, and it was heading directly toward the Kepler system where the Alliance had established its primary shipyard facility. Impressive, Commander David Park observed from his position at the tactical station. They've brought enough firepower to sterilize a dozen star systems. That's the point, Marcus replied calmly. They want to make an example that will terrify the rest of the galaxy into submission. Around the command center representatives from 17 different Alliance civilizations monitored the situation. The Nexari tactical officer reported fleet movements with feline precision. The Corvin clan leaders discussed defensive strategies in their harsh, guttural language. The Zephyrian collective's neural interface hummed with computational activity as their hive mind processed thousands of tactical scenarios simultaneously. "Sir," Dr. Elena Vasquez called from the intelligence station, "we're receiving the Council's ultimatum broadcast." The main display shifted to show Admiral Thexvar's imposing figure aboard the Council flagship Hegemony. His expression carried the cold authority of someone delivering a final warning. "Independent Alliance vessels," Admiral Thexvar announced, "you are in violation of galactic law and order. Your illegal organization represents a clear threat to interstellar stability and the legitimate authority of the Galactic Council." Marcus almost smiled at the phrasing. Even now, the Council couldn't acknowledge that they were facing an organized opposition. In their minds, the Alliance was simply a criminal organization that needed to be suppressed. "You have 1 hour to surrender unconditionally," the Admiral continued. "Disable your weapons, prepare to be boarded, and submit to Council justice. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force." "Standard Council procedure," Captain Jennifer Walsh observed. "Demand immediate submission, threaten massive retaliation, then act surprised when their enemies don't cooperate." "The question is," Tom Rodriguez said, "are we ready for what comes next?" Marcus looked around the command center at the faces of beings who had once been scattered, isolated, and written off by the galaxy's dominant power. 3 years ago, most of them had never heard of each other. Now, they stood together as part of something that the Council couldn't understand, a truly voluntary alliance based on mutual respect rather than imposed hierarchy. "We've been ready for this moment since the day they expelled humanity from their club," Marcus said. "Execute Operation Homecoming." Across the Kepler system, Alliance ships began moving into positions that would have looked like a desperate last stand to any Council military analyst. The outnumbered Alliance fleet appeared to be forming a traditional defensive formation around their primary shipyard facility, exactly the kind of static defense that Council doctrine was designed to crush. Admiral Thexvar watched the Alliance positioning with satisfaction. "Primitive tactical thinking," he announced to his bridge crew. "They're actually going to try to fight us in conventional fleet engagement. This will be over in minutes." But as the Council fleet closed to engagement range, something unexpected happened. The Alliance ships didn't open fire. Instead, they began broadcasting on all communication frequencies simultaneously. "Citizens of the galaxy," Marcus Thompson's voice carried across space, reaching not just the Council fleet, but every inhabited system within range of the sector's communication networks. "Today you witness the true face of the organization that claims to represent galactic civilization." The broadcast wasn't just audio. Dr. Vasquez's intelligence team had prepared a comprehensive information package that included everything they'd learned about Council operations over the past 3 years. The economic data showing how Council tribute requirements kept member species in permanent poverty. The military reports revealing how Council forces maintained order through intimidation and violence. Most damning of all, the recorded conversations from the emergency Council session where their leaders had debated committing genocide to maintain political control. "The Galactic Council has told you that they represent order, stability, and legitimate authority," Marcus continued. "But their own words reveal the truth. They maintain power through fear, exploitation, and the threat of annihilation against anyone who dares to seek alternatives." Aboard the Hegemony, Admiral Thexvar watched in growing alarm as the broadcast reached system after system. This wasn't a military engagement. It was a propaganda operation designed to expose the Council's methods to the entire galaxy. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're detecting signal repeaters throughout this system. The broadcast is being amplified and rebroadcast automatically. Even if we destroy the source, the message will continue transmitting." Then, we destroy everything, Admiral Thexvar snapped. Open fire. Full bombardment of all Alliance assets. The Council fleet opened fire with devastating efficiency. Advanced energy weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts focused their fury on the Alliance defensive formation. The smaller Alliance ships simply couldn't withstand that level of concentrated firepower. But as the Alliance ships died under the overwhelming assault, something strange became apparent to the Council observers. The explosions were wrong. Too bright, too energetic, too much debris for ships of that size. Sir, the Council fleet's sensor operator reported with growing confusion. The Alliance ships appear to be carrying massive fuel loads, much larger than necessary for normal operations. Admiral Thexvar felt his first stirring of unease. What are you saying? I'm saying those ships were essentially flying bombs. The explosions we're seeing aren't from our weapons alone. They're from the Alliance vessels themselves detonating their own fuel supplies. The realization hit Admiral Thexvar like a physical blow. The Alliance hadn't been trying to win a conventional fleet engagement. They'd been staging an elaborate sacrifice play designed to make the Council's victory look like a massacre of outgunned defenders. And it was working. Across the galaxy, civilizations that had never questioned Council authority watched in horror as the most powerful military force in known space obliterated ships that were clearly outmatched, but fighting with desperate courage. The contrast between the Council's overwhelming technological advantage and the Alliance's obvious disadvantage created exactly the impression Marcus had intended. Sir, another officer reported urgently. We're receiving communications from home. Protests are breaking out on 17 Council member worlds. Several planetary governments are demanding explanations for what they're calling an unprovoked massacre. But Marcus wasn't finished. As the last Alliance ship in the defensive formation died in a brilliant explosion, the real trap was revealed. The Kepler system's asteroid belt suddenly came alive with activity as hidden Alliance facilities activated throughout the region. What the Council had taken for a single shipyard facility was actually the central node of a distributed manufacturing network. While their attention had been focused on the obvious target, hundreds of smaller facilities have been operating throughout the system, connected by automated cargo drones and concealed communication arrays. Surprise! Marcus's voice continued over the communication networks. You just destroyed the least important part of our infrastructure while revealing your true nature to the galaxy. Congratulations, Admiral. You've won the battle and lost the war. The asteroid facilities began launching ships that the Council fleet had never seen before. Not the crude converted civilian vessels that had made up the Alliance's apparent navy, but purpose-built warships designed specifically to counter Council tactical doctrine. Fast, heavily shielded, and equipped with weapons that could penetrate Council defensive systems. More importantly, they emerged from multiple directions simultaneously, having used the asteroid belt's complex gravitational environment to approach undetected. The Council fleet found itself surrounded by enemies who understood their capabilities and had prepared specific countermeasures. Impossible, Admiral Dex var britet. Our intelligence reports indicated they had no significant military infrastructure. Your intelligence reports were wrong. Tom Rodriguez's voice joined the communication network. Turns out the primitive humans learned a few things about deception during their brief membership in your organization. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Council military history. Instead of the overwhelming technological dominance they were accustomed to, they faced an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Alliance ships used hit-and-run tactics, exploiting their superior knowledge of the local asteroid field to avoid direct confrontation while striking at Council supply lines and isolated vessels. But the real genius of Marcus's strategy became apparent when the Council fleet tried to withdraw. They discovered that their hyperspace navigation systems had been compromised by quantum interference generators hidden throughout the asteroid field. The same technology that the Alliance had developed for communication security could be used to create hyperspace dead zones that trapped enemy fleets in normal space. Admiral, his navigation officer reported with barely controlled panic, "We can't jump to hyperspace. Something is interfering with our drive systems." "Then, we fight our way out," Admiral Thexvar ordered. But, even as he spoke, he knew the situation had become untenable. His fleet was trapped in a hostile system, surrounded by enemies who knew every asteroid and gravitational anomaly, while the entire galaxy watched as supposedly invincible forces struggle against opponents they dismissed as primitive rebels. The siege of the Council fleet lasted 3 days. Not because the Alliance couldn't destroy them, but because Marcus wanted the galaxy to see what happened when the Council's technological advantages were neutralized. Every hour that passed without Council victory undermined their reputation for inevitable triumph. Finally, Admiral Thexvar requested negotiations under a flag of truce. He found himself facing Marcus Thompson in a neutral meeting area established on one of the larger asteroids. "You could have destroyed us," Admiral Thexvar said without preamble. "Why haven't you?" Marcus studied the Council officer for a moment before responding. "Because this was never about destroying the Council, Admiral. This was about proving that your authority isn't legitimate just because you claim it is. What do you want?" "The same thing we've always wanted. The right to exist without your permission. The freedom to build something better than what you're offering." Admiral Thexvar's expression showed genuine confusion. "You've humiliated us, exposed our methods, demonstrated that we can be defeated. Surely you understand that we can never allow this to stand." "That's where you're wrong," Marcus replied. "You can't stop what's already happening. In the 3 days since you attacked us, 14 more civilizations have requested Alliance membership. Your own member species are questioning why they need Council protection when it clearly can't protect you from us." The truth was devastating in its simplicity. The Council's power had always been based on the perception of inevitability. Once that perception was broken, their entire system would collapse. "The galaxy is bigger than your organization, Admiral," Marcus continued. "There's room for multiple approaches to interstellar civilization. The Council can continue governing the species that choose to accept your authority. But you'll have to do it while competing with alternatives that offer better terms. And if we refuse to accept this division of authority..." Marcus's expression hardened, showing the steel that had carried him through combat zones and political battles. "Then you'll discover that the galaxy contains a lot more primitives than you realized. And most of them have been watching this broadcast very carefully. The final agreement that ended the crisis established principles that would reshape galactic politics. The Council retained authority over their member species and established territories, but formally recognized the right of independent civilizations to form their own associations. The Alliance gained official status as an alternative to Council membership, with guaranteed access to neutral trading zones and exploration rights in unclaimed systems. Most importantly, both organizations committed to resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than military force. As Marcus watched Admiral Thexvar's fleet depart the Kepler system, he reflected on the irony of the situation. The Council had expelled humanity for being unsuitable for galactic civilization. What they'd actually done was force humanity to create a better version of galactic civilization. The Independent Alliance now encompassed 43 species across 16 sectors. Their distributed governance model was proving more stable and responsive than the Council's hierarchical structure. Their technology-sharing protocols were advancing science faster than the Council's proprietary systems. And their mutual defense agreements were providing security without the oppression of military occupation. "So what happens now?" Dr. Vasquez asked as they watched the Council fleet disappear into hyperspace. Marcus smiled, remembering the day he'd watched the Council vote to expel humanity from their organization. "Now we get back to work, building something worth protecting." The ex-Marine had kept his promise. When the Galactic Council wrote off humans as primitive and unsuitable, he'd proven that being underestimated was just another tactical advantage. The galaxy was wide enough for multiple approaches to civilization. And sometimes the species that got kicked out of the club ended up building a better organization than the one that rejected them.